I never thought I'd be the type to chase ghosts in the woods, but back in the summer of '98, curiosity got the better of me and my old college buddies. We were a ragtag group. Me, Jake, our history buff with a knack for tall tales, Sarah, the biologist always sketching plants, and Tom, the quiet one who handled the maps and gear like his life depended on it. We'd grown up hearing stories about the deep hollows of the Appalachian Mountains, places where the ridges folded in on themselves like secrets the earth didn't want told. Folks in the small towns around West Virginia whispered about forbidden zones, stretches of forest off-limits, not just by law, but by some unspoken rule passed down from the old-timers. They said the Cherokee had marked them centuries ago, carving symbols into the oaks to ward off outsiders, warning of spirits that didn't take kindly to trespassers. We laughed it off as superstition, the kind of yarn spun around campfires to scare kids. But Jake had gotten wind of an ancient site, maybe a forgotten native settlement or an old moonshiner's hideout buried under the canopy, and he convinced us it was worth the risk. "What's the worst that could happen?" he said with that grin of his. "We find nothing and have a good hike." So we packed our tents, rations, and a couple of flashlights and headed into the Blue Ridge, far from any trailhead marked on the maps. The drive up was uneventful, winding roads flanked by dense pines that seemed to lean in as if listening. We stopped in a one-stoplight town for supplies, and that's where the first warning came. The old man at the gas station, his face weathered like bark, eyed our backpacks and shook his head. "Y'all headed up to the high hollows? Best turn back. Them woods ain't for poking around. Got whispers up there that'll steal your sense." Sarah rolled her eyes, but I felt a chill, the kind that settles in your gut without reason. We ignored him, of course. Youth makes you invincible, or so we thought. We parked the truck at the edge of a gravel road that petered out into nothing, shouldered our packs, and started the trek. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and wild rhododendrons, the kind that bloom pink in the understory. Birds called overhead, but as we climbed higher, the sounds faded. It was like the forest was holding its breath. We followed a faint deer path Jake swore led to the site, crossing streams that gurgled over mossy rocks. By late afternoon, we spotted the signs, crude carvings on tree trunks, spirals, and jagged lines that looked like they'd been there forever. "Tribal wards," Jake said excitedly, snapping photos. "This is it. We're close." Tom paused, his brow furrowed. "Maybe we should camp here and scout tomorrow." But Jake pushed on, and we followed, the canopy closing overhead like a green lid on a forgotten jar. As dusk crept in, we found a small clearing, ringed by ancient hemlocks that towered like silent guardians. We pitched our tents, built a modest fire, and shared stories under the emerging stars. The night air was cooler up here, carrying a faint mist from the valleys below. I remember lying in my sleeping bag, listening to the crackle of embers dying out when it started. At first, it was just a rustle in the leaves, the kind you blame on a breeze or a small animal foraging. But there was no wind that night. The air hung still and heavy. Then came the whispers, soft, indistinct, like voices murmuring from the edge of a dream. They wove through the branches, rising and falling in a rhythm that almost sounded like words. I sat up, heart thumping, straining to make sense of it. "You hear that?" I whispered to the group. Sarah mumbled something about wind, but Jake perked up. "It's probably echoes from the ridge. Sound travels weird up here." Tom didn't say a word. He just stared into the dark. We dismissed it, chalking it up to exhaustion from the hike, and tried to sleep. But the whispers lingered in my mind, a nagging itch I couldn't scratch. Morning brought a fog that clung to the ground like smoke from a smoldering fire. We brewed coffee over the rekindled flames, but the mood had shifted. The whispers from the night before hung unspoken between us, though no one admitted to losing sleep over them. Jake was eager to press on, pointing to his notes about the rumored ruin, a cluster of stone foundations said to date back before the settlers, hidden in a forbidden hollow the locals called Whispering Gap. "Legends say the old ones guard it," he said with a theatrical flair. "Spirits of the ancestors, or maybe just feral folks who've gone wild up here." Sarah laughed, but it felt forced. We broke camp and ventured deeper, the the path narrowing until we were bushwhacking through thickets of mountain laurel that snagged at our clothes like fingers. The carvings grew more frequent. Deeper gouges in the bark, some fresh enough to ooze sap. "Someone's been here recently," Tom noted quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The forest felt alive in a way that unnerved me. Vines twisted across our way as if trying to bar passage, and the ground softened underfoot, sucking at our boots. By midday, we reached the edge of the hollow, a steep descent into a basin where the trees grew so dense the light filtered green and dim, like underwater. The air down there was cooler, almost clammy, and carried a faint, earthy scent I couldn't place. Decay? Maybe, or something older. We tied ropes to sturdy trunks and rappelled down, our breaths echoing off the rock faces. At the bottom, the ruin emerged from the undergrowth. Low stone walls overgrown with ferns, arranged in a rough circle around what might have been a central fire pit. Artifacts littered the ground, shards of pottery, arrowheads dulled by time. Jake was ecstatic, kneeling to examine them, while Sarah sketched furiously. Tom and I set up a temporary camp nearby, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Eyes from the shadows, or maybe just paranoia. As the afternoon waned, the whispers returned, clearer this time, threading through the canopy like smoke. They weren't English, but something guttural, ancient, pulling at memories I didn't know I had. "Did you hear that?" "It said my name," Sarah said suddenly, her face pale. We froze, listening. There was soft calls, mimicking our voices but twisted, urging us deeper into the hollow. That night, the rain started, a steady patter on the leaves that amplified every sound. We huddled in our tents, the fire sputtering out under the downpour. The whispers grew insistent, weaving in and out of the rain's rhythm, calling names, recounting snippets of our conversations from the day. I lay there, sweat beading on my forehead despite the chill, telling myself it was the wind playing tricks through the ridges. But then Tom unzipped his tent and stepped out. "I hear something," he muttered, "like someone's out there." We called after him, but he wandered toward the ruin, flashlight beam cutting through the mist. Minutes stretched into hours. The whispers swelled, pulling at my thoughts like invisible strings. By dawn, Tom was gone. His tent stood empty, gear neatly packed, footprints leading into the underbrush and abruptly ending, as if he'd been lifted away. No struggle, no cries, just vanished. Panic clawed at us. Jake tried to rationalize it. Maybe he got turned around in the dark. "We'll find him." But his voice shook. We searched the hollow, calling his name until our throats were raw. The forest seemed to close in, branches scraping our skin, roots tripping us like deliberate snares. Sarah found a carving on a nearby tree, a fresh one, resembling Tom's silhouette, etched deep. The second day blurred into a haze of fear and exhaustion. We combed the area around the ruin, but the whispers never stopped, growing louder with the setting sun. They spoke of the old ones, guardians of the hollow who claimed those who intruded, eroding minds until surrender came willingly. Jake, ever the skeptic, started mumbling to himself, eyes darting to the trees. "It's just hallucinations," he insisted. "Dehydration, maybe." But Sarah broke down, tears streaming as she confessed the voices were recounting her childhood fears, things she'd never shared. That evening, as the rain returned, heavier now, she slipped away. I woke to Jake shaking me. "She's gone." Walked off muttering about welcomes. Her footprints mirrored Tom's, leading nowhere. Alone with Jake, the isolation hit like a physical weight. The canopy pressed down, blocking the sky, turning the hollow into a green tomb. We decided to flee, scrambling up the ropes with what gear we could carry. But the whispers followed, echoing in our ears, pulling us back with promises of reunion. Climbing out was agony. My muscles screamed, and Jake lagged behind, his face ashen. "They're calling me," he whispered halfway up. I urged him on, but at the ridge, he paused, eyes glazing over. "The old ones, they say it's peaceful down there." Before I could grab him, he let go, tumbling back into the mist without a sound. I don't remember much after that. Just running through the woods, branches whipping my face, the whispers fading but never fully gone. I stumbled onto a logging road hours later, flagged down a trucker who took me to town. The authorities searched for days, but found nothing. No bodies, no ruin, just endless forest. They wrote it off as accidents, lost hikers in the wild. But I know better. Those whispers linger in my dreams, soft and insistent, calling my name from the untouched canopy. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I feel the pull to return to join the old ones in their silent guard. What hides in those forbidden hollows isn't meant for us. It's a quiet erosion of the soul, leaving echoes that never fade. And on still nights, I wonder if I'll resist forever. Let's move to story 2. I'd always been drawn to the quiet rivers of the Appalachians, those winding creeks that cut through the hollows like veins in the earth's skin. Growing up in eastern Kentucky, I'd heard the old folks talk about places best left alone, stretches of water flanked by ridges where the coal mines had collapsed decades ago, leaving behind unstable ground and stories of men who never came out. They called them forbidden bends, marked by rusted signs from the Forest Service warning of sinkholes and contamination. But after a rough year, losing my job at the mill and my marriage crumbling, I needed solitude. So one crisp autumn morning in 2012, I loaded my kayak onto the truck and headed for a lesser-known tributary of the Cumberland River, a spot I'd scouted on faded maps. The water was high from recent rains, promising a smooth glide through the valleys. No one knew I was going. That was the point. Just me, the current, and the mountains swallowing the world. The launch point was an overgrown gravel pull-off, hidden by kudzu vines that draped like curtains over the banks. I slid the kayak into the water, the chill seeping through my waders as I pushed off. The creek was narrow here, flanked by steep slopes covered in hickory and oak, their leaves turning gold and red in the fall light. Birds chattered overhead, and the paddle dipped rhythmically, cutting through the surface with a soft splash. It felt freeing at first, the isolation wrapping around me like a familiar blanket. I'd planned a 2-day trip, camping overnight on a sandbar and floating back by evening the next. As the morning wore on, the creek meandered deeper into the hills, the ridges rising higher, blocking out cell signal and the distant hum of highways. I passed a few abandoned shacks on the shore, their tin roofs sagging, windows like empty eyes staring back. Locals said these hollows held onto the past, ghosts of miners or feral families who'd shunned society after the wars. I shook off the thought, focusing on the water's pull. By midday, I noticed the signs. Faded buoys bob in the current, chained to submerged rocks, their paint chipped and warnings barely legible. Restricted area. Danger. No entry. I'd read about these zones online. Off-limits due to old mining runoff poisoning the water or unstable caves riddling the banks. But the thrill of pushing boundaries tugged at me. What harm could a quick pass-through do? The creek looked inviting still, though the water had turned a murkier brown, silt stirring up from the bottom. I paddled on, the banks growing wilder, roots twisting out like skeletal fingers grasping at the flow. The air thickened with the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves, humidity pressing down even in the cool of fall. No fish jumped, no turtles basked on logs. It was as if the life had drained from the stretch. I told myself it was just the season, but a nagging unease settled in like eyes on the back of my neck. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the water, the creek narrowed further, forcing me to navigate tight bends where branches overhung like arches. That's when I first saw them, shapes moving parallel to me in the trees. Silent and fleeting, they kept pace with my strokes, dark forms slipping between trunks without a rustle of leaves or snap of twigs. At first, I thought it was deer, maybe a herd foraging along the ridge. But they mimicked my rhythm too perfectly. When I paused to drink from my canteen, they halted. When I paddled harder around a fallen log, they quickened. No calls, no outlines clear enough to identify, just shadows that blended with the fading light. My heart picked up, but I rationalized it. Tricks of the eye, fatigue from the hours on the water. The solitude I'd craved now felt oppressive, the ridges closing in like walls. I scanned the banks for a spot to camp, spotting a small island midstream, a gravel bar overgrown with willows, maybe 20 feet across. I beached the kayak, dragging it up high to avoid the current, and set up my tent as dusk turned the sky bruised purple. The humidity clung like a second skin as I built a small fire, the wood damp and smoking more than burning. I ate a cold meal from my pack, listening to the creek's murmur and the distant hoot of an owl. Night fell heavy in these hollows, the kind of dark that swallows sound. I crawled into my sleeping bag, the ground hard beneath me, and tried to sleep. But then the lights started, faint flickers across the water. Not the erratic glow of fireflies, but deliberate, like lantern signals winking from the opposite bank. They pulsed in patterns, low to the ground, vanishing when I sat up with my flashlight. No houses nearby, no roads. This was deep in the restricted zone. I swept the beam across the creek, catching only twisted roots and underbrush. The shadows from earlier lingered in my mind. Were they connected? I lay back down, telling myself it was marsh gas or reflections off the water, but sleep came fitful, dreams laced with whispers of movement just beyond the tent flaps. I woke before dawn to a scraping sound, like something dragging across gravel. Heart pounding, I unzipped the tent and shone my light. My kayak was halfway back in the shallows, about dipping into the current as if pulled. Vines from the willows coiled around the hull, tight and unnatural, like they'd grown overnight to claim it. But vines don't move that fast, do they? I waded out, the cold water shocking my legs, and yanked it free, thorns scraping my hands. No footprints around, no sign of animals, just the boat repositioned as if by invisible hands. The lights were gone now, but I felt it, a presence not attacking, but observing from the tree lean. Eyes boring into me, patient and unrelenting. Panic bubbled up. I broke camp in a rush, stuffing gear into the kayak without folding it proper. The creek seemed narrower in the gray light, banks pressing closer. As I pushed off, the shapes returned, bolder now, flitting along the ridges, their movements syncing with my frantic paddles. The morning dragged on, the current sluggish as if resisting my escape. Shadows danced in my periphery, brushing close enough that I swore I felt breaths on the water's surface, ripples forming without wind. I paddled harder, muscles burning, the kayak scraping over submerged logs that hadn't been there on the way in. Whispers of doubt crept in. Had I imagined the buoys? Was this bend truly forbidden, or just a tale to keep folks out? But the watchfulness was real, eroding my nerve with every glance at the trees. No faces, no forms, just relentless pursuit, turning my solitude into a cage of terror. Hours blurred, the ridges finally parted, the water clearing as I exited the zone. I beached at a public landing miles downstream, trembling as I loaded the kayak. Rangers found me there, asked if I was all right. I mumbled about getting lost, not daring to speak of the shadows. Years later, that trip haunts me like a half-remembered dream. I avoid rivers now, stick to the open fields where nothing hides. But on quiet nights, when the wind sighs through the pines outside my window, I feel those eyes again, watching, waiting. Whatever guards those forbidden bends doesn't need claws or teeth. It wears you down with silence, turning your own mind against you. I wonder if I truly escaped, or if a piece of me lingers there, paddling endlessly in the murk. The mountains keep their secrets, and sometimes I think they're still calling me back. Let's move to story 3. It was back in the fall of 2007 when I first heard about the Sealed Hollow, a name whispered among the old folks in the backwoods of eastern Tennessee like a curse you didn't dare say aloud. I was part of a small team of botanists from the university, chasing rare ferns and orchids that supposedly thrived in the untouched pockets of the Smoky Mountains. Our lead, Dr. Harlan, was a stubborn man, driven by grants and publications, and he'd gotten a tip from an archived journal about a valley cut off from the maps, sealed, they said, by Cherokee elders long before the settlers came. Locals called it cursed ground, a place where the ridges folded in on themselves, trapping echoes of the past that drove men mad. We laughed it off in the diner where we stopped for coffee, but the waitress, an older woman with eyes like chipped flint, overheard and shook her head. "Y'all best stay clear of that hollow. The old one sealed it for a reason. Voices there that'll unravel your mind." Harlan dismissed her with a wave, but I felt a twinge in my gut, the kind you get when the wind shifts before a storm. We set out at dawn, our packs heavy with sample kits, tents, and enough rations for a week. The trail started innocent enough, a dirt path winding through stands of hemlock and poplar, leaves crunching under our boots in the crisp air. There were 4 of us: Harlan, me, Lisa, a grad student with a sharp eye for plants, and Mike, our quiet field tech who handled the GPS and ropes. The mountains rose around us like ancient sentinels, mist clinging to the peaks as the sun climbed. We hiked for hours, crossing babbling creeks and scrambling over fallen logs, the forest alive with the chatter of squirrels and the distant call of crow. But as we veered off the marked paths, following Harlan's faded coordinates, the woods changed. The underbrush thickened, briars snagging at our pants like warnings, and the air grew heavier, laced with a dampness that settled in your lungs. We spotted the first carvings then, rough etchings on tree bark, spirals, and jagged lines that looked deliberate, old as the hills themselves. "Native wards," Harlan said, excitement edging his voice. "Proof we're on the right track." Lisa photographed them, but Mike paused, tracing one with his finger. "Feels like they're watching," he muttered. I shook it off, blaming the altitude. By late afternoon, we reached the rim of the hollow, a steep drop into a basin shrouded in fog, the ridges curving inward like a cupped hand. No birds sang down there. The silence was profound, broken only by our breaths. We rigged ropes to the sturdiest oaks and rappelled down, the descent taking longer than expected as the mist swallowed the light above. At the bottom, the valley floor was a tangle of ferns and moss-covered rocks, the air thicker still, muffling our footsteps like we were walking on cotton. The vegetation was unlike anything I'd seen, twisted vines with leaves etched in patterns that mirrored the tree carvings, almost like deliberate markings. We set up camp in a small clearing, pitching tents around a fire pit Harlan dug. As evening fell, the fog rolled in heavier, turning the hollow into an isolated world. We gathered samples, Harlan jabbering about breakthroughs, but I noticed how our voices echoed strangely, delayed, like they were bouncing off invisible walls before returning distorted. That first night, around the crackling fire, the echoes truly began. We were sharing stories, the flames casting long shadows on the ridge walls, when Lisa called out a joke about getting lost. Her words came back a second later, but warped, lower in pitch, like a mimic from a dark. We chuckled nervously, blaming the acoustics of the bowl-shaped valley. But then Mike asked quietly if anyone else felt uneasy, and his echo replied before we could, "Yes, alone." It wasn't his voice exactly. It was deeper, threaded with a rasp that sent chills up my spine. Harlan scoffed, just the wind playing tricks through the rocks. But as the fire died down and we retreated to our tents, the echoes lingered, faint at first, repeating fragments of our conversation in that unnatural tone. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the canvas ceiling, the humidity pressing down like a weight. Sleep came in fits, dreams haunted by voices murmuring just out of reach. Morning brought a gray light filtering through the fog, and with it, the first real unease. Our tents were slashed, not ragged tears from claws or branches, but precise cuts forming symbols that matched the tree etchings. No footprints around, no sign of animals. It was as if the valley itself had reached out in the night. Harlan examined them, his face paling. Vandals, maybe, or wind damage. But we all knew better. The cuts were too clean, too intentional. Lisa found one of her sample bags rearranged, plants she'd collected the day before wilted and twisted into shapes that looked like warnings. We tried to laugh it off, packing up to explore deeper into the hollow for the rare orchids Harlan insisted were there. But as we hiked, the paths looped strangely, trails we'd marked with flagging tape leading back to camp in circles, the GPS spinning uselessly. The echoes grew bolder, no longer just repeats, but responses. I'd think about my fear of tight spaces, a secret from childhood, and the valley would murmur back, trapped, always trapped. It invaded our thoughts, pulling at the edges of sanity. By midday, tension simmered among us. Mike grew withdrawn, staring at the ridge walls as if expecting them to close in. We stopped for lunch by a trickle of a stream, the water tasting metallic, and that's when it escalated. Lisa whispered to me about turning back, her voice low. "This place knows things it shouldn't." Before I could reply, the echo boomed from the rocks. "Too late, intruder." Her eyes widened, face draining of color. Harlan tried to rally us, but his commands came back mocked, twisted into pleas. We pressed on, desperation fueling our steps, but the vegetation seemed to shift, vines curling across paths we just cleared. Afternoon shadows lengthened, the fog thickening until we could barely see 10 feet ahead. Mike stopped suddenly, tilting his head. "They're calling my name," he said, voice flat. We heard it then, echoes weaving his full name, laced with memories he hadn't shared, his brother's accident, the guilt he'd carried. He wandered off the path, drawn toward a cluster of etched boulders, mumbling responses to the voices only he could fully hear. We searched for hours, calling until our throats ached, but Mike was gone, swallowed by the mist. The echoes mocked our cries, turning them into laughter that echoed from all sides. Panic set in as night approached. Harlan's bravado cracked, and he admitted we'd ignored too many signs. We retreated to camp, the fire struggling against the damp. Around the flames, Lisa broke down, confessing a hidden regret from her past, a lost child she'd never mentioned. The valley replied instantly, a chilling confirmation. "Gone forever, your fault." She screamed, clutching her head as the echoes swelled into a cacophony, invading our minds with personal horrors. My own fears surfaced unbidden. Abandonment, failure, and the voices amplified them, whispering details I'd buried deep. Tents slashed again that night, symbols glowing faintly in the ember's light. Harlan tried to lead us out of first light, but the paths looped endlessly, the ridges seeming taller, the hollow deeper. Lisa was next. She woke raving about the voices promising peace deeper in, her eyes glazed like Mike's. We grabbed her arms, but she broke free, stumbling into the fog toward the heart of the valley. Harlan and I chased, branches whipping our faces, but she vanished amid the twisted trees, her final cry echoing back as a taunt. Alone now, Harlan's resolve shattered. He sat by the dying fire, muttering to the echoes as they recounted his ambition's costs, lives overlooked in pursuit of glory. I begged him to climb the ropes with me, but he shook his head. "They know me too well," he whispered. As dawn broke gray and cold, he wandered off, following the calls like the others. I was left in a silence that wasn't silent, the echoes now a chorus in my head, pulling at my will. Terror fueled my escape. I scrambled up the ropes, muscles burning, the voices pursuing like shadows. At the rim, the fog cleared slightly, and I ran, through briars and over ridges, not stopping until I hit a logging road miles away. A ranger truck found me collapsed, dehydrated and babbling. They searched the hollow for weeks, but found no trace of the others. No camp, no carvings, just endless forest. Officials called it disorientation, exposure. They sealed the area tighter with fences and signs. But I know the truth. That valley holds on its secrets, echoes that unravel the soul, thread by thread. Years on, in the quiet of my apartment far from the mountains, the whispers return on still nights, faint at first, recounting fears I thought I'd escaped. They cling like the fog, a quiet madness replaying those forbidden truths. Sometimes I wonder if I truly left, or if part of me lingers there, echoing in the sealed depths, waiting for the next fool to listen. Story 4. I'd always had a passion for documenting the wild, those forgotten corners of the Appalachians where the ridges hide secrets from the world. Back in the spring of 2015, I was part of a small indie filming crew. Me on sound, our director Alex with his endless enthusiasm, cinematographer Mia, who could frame a shot like poetry, and our tech guy, Ben, who handled the drones and cameras like extensions of his own body. We'd heard rumors about a vast tract in the heart of the Monongahela National Forest, a forbidden zone closed off by the Forest Service under the guise of biodiversity protection. Signs dotted the perimeter. Restricted area, no entry, hazardous terrain. But locals in the nearby hollows whispered it was more than that. Ancient ground guarded by the Silent Ones, feral descendants of miners who'd gone mad in the collapses, or spirits of Ashani who'd cursed the land against intruders. Alex saw it as prime material for our documentary on Vanishing Wilderness, a chance to capture raw footage of untouched nature. "What's the harm?" he said over beers in a dingy bar outside Elkins. "We sneak in, film some wildlife, get out. No one's the wiser." Mia and Ben nodded along, but I felt a knot in my stomach, remembering my grandpa's tales of folks vanishing in those woods, their echoes lingering like bad dreams. We geared up at dawn, parking the van on a forgotten logging road and hiking in under cover of mist. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the kind that clings to your clothes long after you've left. We carried lightweight cameras, tripods, and enough batteries for a few days, planning to camp rough and film elusive critters like bobcats or maybe even a black bear. The perimeter fence was rusted chain link, easy to slip under where erosion had dug a gap. Once inside, the forest closed around us like a living thing, the understory dense with rhododendrons and laurel that brushed our legs like whispering hands. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in eerie shafts, turning the ground into a patchwork of gold and shadow. Birds called sporadically at first, but as we pushed deeper, their songs faded, replaced by a profound stillness that made every crunch of leaves underfoot echo unnaturally loud. Alex led the way, his GPS beeping faintly, though the signal wavered. "This is gold," he murmured, setting up the first trail cam on a sturdy oak. Mia captured establishing shots, the lens lingering on twisted roots that snaked across the path like veins. By midday, we'd set up a base camp in a small clearing ringed by ancient hemlocks, their branches forming a natural dome overhead. We deployed more cameras, motion-activated ones strapped to trees, aimed at game trails we'd spotted. Ben fiddled with the feeds on his laptop, grinning as grainy images popped up, a deer grazing, leaves rustling in the breeze. But as the afternoon wore on, something shifted. While scouting a ridge for better angles, I noticed figures in the distance, still as statues, blending seamlessly with the tree trunks. They weren't moving, just standing there, outlines hazy in the dappled light. No clothing I could make out, no faces. They could have been oddly shaped stumps or tricks of the eye. I pointed them out to Mia, who zoomed in with her camera. "Probably just rocks or deadwood," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. We kept filming, but when we looked away to adjust gear, they'd shift, subtly closer, or in a different spot, always just out of clear view. No tribes in these parts anymore, no known hermits. These felt like something older, watchers that didn't belong to the world we knew. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridges, casting long shadows that swallowed the clearing, our equipment started glitching. Ben's laptop screen flickered with static, the trail cam feeds cutting in and out. When we reviewed the footage, it wasn't blank. Faint outlines laced the interference, humanoid shapes etched in the noise like ghosts in the machine. "Interference from the terrain," Ben muttered, rebooting everything. But the batteries drained faster than they should, even the spares we'd packed. We built a fire to ward off the chill, the flames crackling in the heavy air, and shared stories to ease the tension. Alex talked about legendary feral people in these mountains, families who'd fled society after the Great Depression and turned wild, surviving on roots and cunning. Mia laughed it off, but I caught her glancing at the tree line, where the darkness seemed to pulse. Night fell like a blanket, the kind of pitch black only the deep woods can offer, broken by our headlamps and the fire's glow. No owls hooted, no crickets chirped, just silence pressing in, thick and watchful. Ben volunteered for the first scout that night, taking a handheld camera to check the outer traps. "I'll be back in 20, he said over the radio, his voice tinny in the quiet. We heard him rustling through the underbrush, narrating softly. "Nothing out here but shadows. Wait, what's that?" Then static, followed by a murmur. "Eyes, eyes in the bark." The radio cut out. We called his name, our voices swallowed by the night, and grabbed flashlights to search. The beams cut swaths through the mist rising from the ground, revealing twisted trunks that looked more alive than before. We found his gear an hour later, arranged in a perfect circle on a bed of moss. Camera, radio, backpack, all untouched, no signs of struggle. Ben was gone, vanished without a trace. Panic edged our voices as we huddled back at camp. Alex tried to rationalize it. He must have fallen, hit his head. We'll find him at dawn. But Mia's hands shook as she replayed the last footage. More static, with those faint outlines crowding closer, like figures emerging from the trees themselves. The next day dragged under an overcast sky, the ridges looming like barriers we couldn't breach. We searched in pairs, calling Ben's name until our throats burned, but the forest gave nothing back. The watchers returned, or maybe they'd never left. Still forms in the periphery, blending with the bark, shifting only when our backs were turned. They didn't approach, didn't make a sound. It was their silence that gnawed at us, a heavy presence that pressed on our chests like the humidity before a storm. Mia's camera captured glimpses, blurry shapes that could be people, gaunt and motionless, eyes like hollows in the wood. Equipment failures worsened. Drones wouldn't lift off, screens froze on those eerie outlines. By afternoon, exhaustion set in, our movements sluggish in the oppressive quiet. Alex grew irritable, snapping at shadows, while Mia whispered about feeling watched, not just seen but judged. We found carvings on nearby trees, crude figures etched deep, resembling us in crude detail, as if marking our intrusion. Night 2 was worse. The mist thickened, turning the clearing into an island in a sea of white. We stoked the fire high, but its light only highlighted the encroaching dark. The watchers drew closer. I turned my head and swear a figure stood just beyond the glow, still as death, vanishing when I focused. No breaths, no footsteps, just unrelenting gaze. Sleep evaded us. We took shifts, but the silence amplified every rustle of leaves, every creak of branches. Mia broke first, sobbing quietly about eyes boring into her soul, recounting childhood fears of being lost forever. Alex tried to comfort her, but his eyes darted wildly. Sometime after midnight, he stepped out to check the perimeter, radio in hand. We heard him mutter over the static, "They're everywhere, watching." Then nothing. We found his gear at dawn, circled like Ben's, his camera showing final frames of outlines crowding the lens, silent and inexorable. Alone with Mia, the isolation crushed us. The forest felt alive, the watchers now bold enough to stand at the tree lean during the day, shifting positions like sentinels repositioning. We packed what we could, abandoning most gear, and fled toward the perimeter. The paths twisted, ridges looping us back until disorientation set in. Mia lagged, her breaths ragged. "I can't. They're calling without words," she whispered, eyes glazing. I urged her on, but at a stream crossing, she froze, staring at a figure blended with a willow. "They want us to stay," she said, stepping toward it. I grabbed her arm, but she pulled free, wandering into the mist. Her final cry echoed faintly, then silence. I ran then, blindly, branches tearing at my skin, the weight of unseen eyes pushing me forward. Hours blurred. I stumbled through the fence gap as dusk fell, collapsing on the logging road. A passing ranger found me raving about watchers, but searches turned up nothing. No crew, no camp, just endless woods. Years have passed, but that domain haunts me like a shadow I can't shake. I avoid the mountains now, stick to city lights where silence can't press so close. But in quiet moments, I feel their gaze, boring in from memories, eroding my sanity with the knowledge that we intruded on something ancient, unyielding. Were they feral survivors, guardians of the old ways, or just the forest way of reclaiming its own? The silence offers no answers, only a lingering dread that whispers. They'll watch forever, waiting for the next to cross the line. Sometimes I wonder if Mia, Alex, and Ben are still out there, standing still among the trees, part of the domain now. And on windless nights, I feel the pull to return, to stand with them in the quiet. Story 5. After my wife passed that bitter winter in 2018, the world felt too loud, too crowded with sympathies I didn't want. I'd grown up in the hollows of southern West Virginia, where the mountains cradle secrets like a mother does her child, and I knew the woods could swallow a man's grief if he let them. So I packed light, a backpack with essentials, a tent, and my old shotgun for comfort, and headed for the Bard Bog, a forsaken stretch in the Kanawha forest that folks avoided like the plague. It was off-limits, fenced with rusted wire and signs warning of toxic runoff from abandoned coal mines, the water black with chemicals that could eat through skin. Locals spun yarns about it being cursed ground, where miners' ghosts wandered or feral kin, descendants of those who'd fled society after the Union busts, lurked in the murk. I ignored the tales. I just needed solitude, a place to mourn without eyes on me. Slipping under the fence at dawn, the ground squelched under my boots, the air thick with the metallic tang of polluted earth. Reeds and cattails swayed in the still morning, fog rolling in from the ridges like smoke from a dying fire. The bog stretched out like a forgotten wound in the landscape. Pockets of dark water reflecting the overcast sky, interspersed with hummocks of grass and stunted trees twisted by the poison below. I waded in carefully, the mud sucking at my steps, each one releasing bubbles that smelled of rot and sulfur. No birds sang here. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional drip from overhanging branches. I planned to hike deep, set up camp on a drier rise, and spend a few days fishing the edges, if anything lived in that tainted soup, and letting the quiet numb the ache in my chest. As I pushed on, the fog thickened, turning the world into a gray haze where distances blurred. That's when I first noticed the traces, footprints in the mud, not mine, bare and elongated, circling my path before veering deeper into the marsh. They weren't fresh, but not old either, the edges soft like they'd been made hours ago. I paused, heart quickening a bit, but chalked it up to some poacher or drifter ignoring the barriers like me. Curiosity tugged. Maybe company wasn't all bad. I followed them tentatively, the ground growing softer, forcing me to hop from tussock to avoid sinking. By midday, the traces led me to a cluster of half-sunken relics. Rusted pickaxes and shovels entangled in roots, remnants of the old mines that had scarred these hills. Bones poked through the muck nearby, small ones like raccoon or possum, but one looked longer, humanoid, maybe, wrapped in vines like the bog was claiming it back. A chill settled despite the humid air. I'd heard stories of bodies lost in these wetlands, miners swallowed during floods or collapses. The reeds around me whispered without wind, a soft rustle that sounded almost like breaths, parting slightly to reveal more debris. An old lantern, its glass cracked, half-buried. Unease gnawed at the edges of my mind, but the solitude I'd craved wrapped around it, masking the growing dread. I pressed on, the footprints guiding me like a silent invitation, the fog closing in until the ridges were just faint shadows on the horizon. I found a semi-dry knoll by early afternoon, a rise above the waterline dotted with scrubby pines, and pitched my tent. The sun filtered weakly through the haze, casting long shadows that danced oddly across the marsh. As evening crept in, the bog transformed. The light faded to a bruised twilight, the air cooling and heavy with moisture that beaded on my skin. I built a small fire with dry tinder I'd packed, the flames struggling against the damp, casting flickering glows on the surrounding reeds. Supper was simple, canned beans heated over the coals, and I sat listening to the nothing, the silence pressing like a physical weight. My thoughts drifted to her, the way cancer had hollowed her out, leaving me alone in our empty cabin back in town. Tears came unbidden, blurring the firelight. That's when the sound started. Soft splashes in the distance, like something wading through the shallows, approaching slow and deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the fog-shrouded water. Nothing at first, just ripples spreading out, then shapes in the mist, humanoid but stretched, elongated silhouettes gliding without disturbing the surface more than a whisper. They hovered at the edge of visibility, pale forms that retreated as the light hit them, melting back into the gray. My breath caught. Animals? No. Too upright, too purposeful. I called out, voice cracking the quiet. Who's there? But only the splashes answered, closer now, circling the knoll. Sleep evaded me that night. The tent walls thin against the encroaching dark. The splashes continued intermittently, punctuated by the reed's whispers, building a rhythm that invaded my thoughts. I clutched the shotgun, finger on the trigger, staring at the zipper flap as if expecting it to part. Dawn broke gray and reluctant, the fog thicker than before, clinging like a shroud. Crawling out, I found my supplies rearranged. My backpack unzipped, contents spilled in a neat semicircle around the cold fire pit. No theft, just moved, the cans aligned, my knife stuck point down in the mud. Scratched into the earth nearby were marks, crude symbols, like a script from old mining logs or native wards, unreadable but felt in my bones, a warning that twisted my gut. Footprints ringed the camp now, the same bare, elongated ones, weaving in and out like a dance. Panic flickered, but the bog's stillness drew me in, a quiet compulsion masking the fear. I repacked hastily, telling myself it was kids playing pranks or my mind fraying from grief. But as I broke camp, the traces reappeared, leading deeper still, and against better judgment, I followed, the marsh breathing around me, alive in its decay. The day blurred into a haze of mud and mist, the ground treacherous, forcing slow progress. The relics grew more frequent. Shards of old timber from mine shafts, a rusted helmet half sunk, vines coiling through eye sockets like tendrils of memory. The footprints multiplied, intersecting mine, circling back as if hurting me. Whispers from the reeds intensified, soft susurrations that almost formed words, recounting fragments of my loss. Her name, murmured low, the date of her passing etched in the air. Hallucinations, I thought, from the toxic fumes seeping up, but the unease deepened, a subtle horror rewriting my solitude into isolation. By afternoon, exhaustion set in, my legs leaden from the suck of the mud. I stopped at another rise, higher ground with a view of the endless marsh stretching under the ridges. Setting up again felt futile, but the fog boxed me in, directions lost. As dusk fell, the splashes returned closer, the shapes bolder in the mist. Pale, gaunt figures that mimicked human posture but moved with an unnatural glide, retreating just as my light sought them out. That second night was torment. The fires sputtered out early, drowned by rising damp, leaving me in darkness broken only by my flashlight's waning beam. The sounds encircled the tent, splashes, whispers, the occasional scrape like nails on wood. I huddled inside, shotgun across my lap, mind racing with legends I dismissed, feral people, poisoned by the mines, surviving in the bog shadows, watching intruders with silent malice. Or worse, echoes of the dead, miners trapped in the floods, their forms warped by time and toxin. Something brushed the tent wall, soft but deliberate, and I fired blindly into the night, the blast echoing across the marsh like thunder. Silence followed, profound and accusing, but when I ventured out of first light, more messages awaited. Symbols scratched around the tent, my supplies tampered with again. Food packets opened, arranged in patterns that mirrored the bones I'd seen. The marsh seemed to pulse now, the ground undulating faintly, drawing me in with its stillness, the traces leading ever deeper. Terror finally overrode curiosity. I abandoned most gear, slinging only the essentials, and fled, or tried to. The paths looped, the fog a labyrinth that turned me back on myself. Footprints mocked me, crossing mine, herding me towards sunken pits where black water bubbled. Shapes flitted in the periphery, elongated and pale, never attacking but observing, their presence eroding my will like the acid in the soil. Hours stretched, my boots filled with muck, skin blistering from the toxins. Whispers dogged my steps, recounting regrets, words I'd never said to her, failures amplified in the quiet. I stumbled upon a relic cluster, a collapsed mine entrance, timbers rotted, bones scattered. Human this time, skulls grinning from the reeds. The shapes gathered there, silent sentinels in the mist, retreating as I approached but closing the circle. Panic surged. I ran blindly, splashing through shallows that pulled at my legs, the bog breathing heavier, alive with intrusion. I don't recall how I escaped, stumbling through the fence as night fell, collapsing on a gravel road where a trucker found me raving about traces in the murk. Rescuers searched, but found nothing. No camp, no relics, just endless bogs swallowing evidence. Doctors blamed exposure, grief-induced delusions from the fumes. But the traces followed in my mind, rewriting memories into loops of what-ifs and whispers. Years later, in my quiet cabin far from the hollows, the silence brings them back, soft splashes in dreams, elongated shadows at the window's edge. Whatever haunts that barred marsh doesn't need violence. It intrudes subtly, turning loss into eternal watchfulness. Sometimes, I feel the pull to return, to follow the footprints deeper, joining the pale forms in their silent domain. The mountains keep their poisoned secrets, and I wonder if she'll be waiting there, elongated and pale in the mist. Story 6. I'd never been one for breaking rules. But after losing my job at the sawmill and watching my life unravel like a frayed rope, the call of the mountains grew too strong to ignore. It was the summer of 2010, and I'd gathered a small group of old friends for what I pitched as a rugged hike in the Alleghenies. Me and my buddy Ray, who knew every back trail from his hunting days, our mutual pal Jenna with her endless energy, and quiet old Mark, a history nut who'd read too many books on native lore. We'd heard whispers about the prohibited ridge, a jagged spine in the Pennsylvania wilds, off-limits by Forest Service decree due to seismic shifts from old fracking sites that made the ground unstable. But the locals in the valley towns spoke of deeper taboos. Cherokee curses sealing the area, or feral clans descended from escaped convicts who'd vanished into the hollows during the Depression. Stay clear. The barkeep had warned us over warm beers. That ridge veils things best left hidden. We laughed it off as superstition, packing our gear and slipping past the faded warning signs at dawn, the air crisp with pine and the promise of escape. The climb started easy enough, a faint game trail winding up through stands of oak and hickory, leaves rustling underfoot like pages turning in an old book. Birds called overhead, and the sun dappled the path, warming our backs as we shouldered packs heavy with tents, food, and water. Ray led, machete in hand for the occasional briar patch, joking about bagging a deer on the sly. Jenna snapped photos with her camera, capturing wildflowers clinging to the slopes. Mark trailed, muttering about ancient burial grounds rumored to dot the ridges. As we ascended, the trail steepened, the underbrush thickening into walls of mountain laurel that snagged at our clothes like fingers reluctant to let go. We hacked through, sweat beading on our brows, the air growing thinner and laced with a faint, earthy dampness. Faded carvings appeared on boulders along the way, crude spirals and figures etched deep, weathered but deliberate. Wards, Mark said, tracing one. The old tribes marked places like this to keep spirits in or people out. Ray rolled his eyes, but I felt the first twinge of unease, the kind that settles in your bones when the woods turn watchful. By midday, we'd crested the ridge, the summit a narrow spine of rock overlooking a veiled hollow below. A thick fog hung there like a curtain, obscuring the view, swirling lazily in the breeze. We paused to catch our breath, the ridges around us folding into endless green waves. That's when we heard it, murmurs filtering up through the mist, hushed conversations like a gathering just out of sight. At first, We thought it was the wind playing through the crevices or maybe echoes from distant hikers. But they persisted, rising and falling in rhythms that almost formed words. Jenna cocked her head. "Sounds like people down there. Talking." We strained to listen, but the fog muffled it, turning clarity into suggestion. Ray shrugged it off. "Probably just the rocks settling. This place is unstable, remember?" We decided to descend a bit, curiosity overriding caution, rigging ropes to a sturdy pine and lowering ourselves into the haze. The air cooled as we dropped, the mist clinging to our skin like cobwebs, the murmurs growing clearer with each foot. At the bottom, the hollow opened into a tangled basin, ferns carpeting the ground and ancient trees towering like silent judges. The voices sharpened here, not random, but recounting snippets that hit too close. My name mentioned in a whisper, followed by details of my wife's leaving last year, things I'd never share with the group. "How'd they know that?" I muttered, heart thudding. Jenna paled, hearing her own secrets echoed back. A childhood accident she'd buried deep. The murmurs wove through the fog, pulling at memories like threads from a sweater. We explored tentatively, finding more carvings on the rocks, depictions of figures, elongated and absorbed into the landscape, vines twisting through their forms like they'd become part of the ridge. Mark's face drained of color. "These are warnings. Intruders who didn't leave." Ray tried to laugh, but it came out forced. We set up camp on a flat outcrop, the fog veiling the sky, turning day into perpetual twilight. The murmurs faded as we built a fire, but their echo lingered in our minds, a quiet pull that made conversation stilted. Night fell heavy, the kind of dark that presses in from all sides, the fire's glow a fragile bubble against it. We huddled close, sharing stories to drown the silence, but the veil of mist thickened, rolling in waves that obscured the treeline. The murmurs returned, louder now, conversations that shifted into personal calls. Jenna froze mid-sentence, her eyes widening. "That's my brother," she whispered, voice trembling. Her sibling had died young in a car wreck, a loss she rarely spoke of. But there it was, his voice filtering through the fog, calling her name with a warmth that chilled us all. She stood, peering into the mist, and we grabbed her arms. "It's a trick," Ray insisted, echoes bouncing weird. But figures emerged briefly in the haze, shadowy outlines, beckoning with subtle gestures before dissolving. No faces, no sounds from them, just a silent invitation that tugged at the soul. We retreated to our tents, the fire sputtering out, but sleep was impossible. The voices invaded dreams, recounting regrets in hushed tones that felt too real. Morning brought no relief, the fog denser, the ridge seeming steeper, as if the hollow had deepened overnight. We packed quickly, the plan to climb out and leave this cursed place behind. But Jenna was changed, her eyes distant, murmuring responses to the voices only she could hear fully. As we rigged the ropes, she wandered toward the mist's edge, drawn by her brother's call. "He's waiting," she said, stepping into the veil. We shouted, lunging after her, but the fog swallowed her whole. No cry, no struggle, just gone. Panic surged. Ray cursed, hauling on the ropes, but Mark hesitated, tilting his head. "My grandfather, he's here too." We'd known his family history, lost kin in the mines, but the pull was evident, eroding his resolve. We searched for Jenna fruitlessly, the murmurs swelling into a chorus of our histories, secrets laid bare in the air. Carvings we hadn't noticed before dotted the outcrop now, fresh ones resembling Jenna's silhouette, vines etched curling around it. The day blurred into desperation. Ray and I urged Mark to climb, but the voices targeted him, whispering of family betrayals he'd confided in me once over whiskey. He broke, stepping into the mist with a resigned murmur. "They're calling me home." Ray and I were alone then, the fog pressing closer, figures flitting at the edges, beckoning without words. The quiet pull gnawed at us. The ridge's way of claiming intruders, not with violence, but erosion, veiling the line between memory and madness. Ray climbed first, his breath ragged, but halfway up he paused, eyes glazing. My old man, after the war. His father had vanished in these woods years ago, a story he'd buried. Before I could shout, he let go, tumbling back into the haze silently. Terror fueled my ascent. I scrambled up the ropes, muscles screaming, the murmurs pursuing like shadows, recounting my failures in intimate detail. At the summit, the fog cleared just enough to run. Down the trail, briars tearing at me, the voices fading but echoing faintly in my ears. I stumbled onto a service road hours later, flagged down a logger, who took me town. Authorities searched for days but found no trace, no bodies, no camp, just unstable ground and endless mist. They blamed landslides, disorientation. The ridge stayed prohibited, fences reinforced. But I know the truth. That veil hides a forbidden grasp, murmurs that unravel the mind thread by thread. Years on, away from the mountains in a city apartment, the quiet brings them back. Faint conversations on windless nights, beckoning figures in dreams. They recount secrets I thought buried, pulling at the edges of sanity. Sometimes, I feel the ridge's call, a dread that blurs reality, wondering if my friends wait there, absorbed into the landscape, whispering for me to join. The Appalachians keep their taboos, and I fear one day the veil will part for me again. Story 7. I'd always had a deep respect for the old growth forests of the Appalachians. Those ancient stands where the trees stood like silent witnesses to centuries of hardship and hidden lives. Back in the fall of 2013, I was heading a small botany survey team from the State University tasked with cataloging rare lichens and ferns in the remote corners of the Pisgah National Forest. The team was tight-knit. Me, with my years of field experience. Eliza, my sharp-eyed assistant fresh out of grad school. Old-timer Doc Harlan, a retired professor who'd forgotten more about plants than most ever learned. And young Pete, our tech was who handled the GPS and sample kits like they were extensions of his arms. We'd gotten permits for most areas, but there was one spot that nagged at me. A locked grove deep in the ridges, barred by chain-link fences and signs citing endangered species preservation. Locals in the nearby hollows whispered it was more than that. A place cursed by the Cherokee, or home to feral families who'd gone wild after the logging camps shut down in the 30s, blending into the bark like ghosts. Nature reclaims its own there. An old-timer at the gas station had warned, his eyes shadowed under his cap. We ignored it, of course. Science doesn't bow to superstition. Slipping through a rusted gap in the fence at dawn, the air thick with the scent of leaf mold and mist, we ventured in, driven by the thrill of untouched data. The grove unfolded like a forgotten cathedral, the ancient hemlocks and oaks towering overhead, their canopies interlocking to form a dome that dimmed the sunlight to a perpetual twilight. Moss carpeted the ground, soft under our boots, and vines draped like veils from the branches. No birds sang. The silence was profound, broken only by our breaths and the occasional snap of a twig. We set up base camp in a small clearing, pitching tents and laying out grids for sampling. Eliza was excited, kneeling to examine a cluster of walking ferns that clung to rotting logs. Doc muttered about the age of the trees, some predating the revolution, bark furrowed deep like wrinkled skin. Pete calibrated his equipment, the beeps sounding intrusive in the hush. As we fanned out, clippers and vials in hand, I felt the first prick of unease. The grove seemed to watch us, the undergrowth denser than maps suggested, paths narrowing as if the forest was closing ranks. Samples came easy at first. Lichens scraped from bark, ferns pressed between sheets. But by midday, they began to wilt unnaturally fast, turning brown and brittle in our bags, as if rejecting our touch. Humidity, maybe, Doc grumbled, but his voice lacked conviction. As the afternoon wore on, the glimpses started small, easy to dismiss. I catch a flash of eyes reflecting in the undergrowth, deep-set and unblinking, vanishing when I turned to look. At first, I thought it was wildlife, a deer or fox wary of intruders. But they appeared too often, always at the edge of vision, retreating into the shadows. Eliza saw them too, pausing mid-sample to stare into the ferns. "Did you see that?" Like someone peeking. We searched, but found nothing. No tracks, no broken branches. The leaves began to rustle then. Not with wind, for the air hung still and heavy, but in patterns, short bursts and long pauses like Morse code spelling out warnings. Pete joked about it being the trees talking, but his laugh echoed hollowly off the trunks. We pressed on, marking our paths with flagging tape, but the grove felt alive in a way that unsettled the soul, roots surfacing subtly underfoot like veins pulsing just beneath the skin. By evening, we gathered around a modest fire, the flames struggling against the damp wood, casting flickering shadows that danced across the ancient bark. We shared stories to ease the tension, Doc recounting old logging tales, Eliza talking about her city life back home. But the glimpses persisted. I'd swear eyes gleamed from the tree lean, watching without movement. Pete volunteered to scout a nearby ridge for better signal, his flashlight beam cutting through the growing dusk. He returned pale, face drained of color, muttering about guardians woven into the bark. He claimed he'd chased a glimpse, a shadowy figure blending with a trunk, only to find carvings when he approached, crude faces etched deep, eyes hollow like the ones we'd seen. They moved, he whispered, hands trembling. The bark shifted. We dismissed it as fatigue, the dim light playing tricks, but sleep came uneasy that night. The tents shook without wind, gentle at first, like breaths against the canvas. Roots surfaced around camp, coiling subtly over our gear, as if the ground was reaching up. Morning light filtered weak and green through the canopy, revealing the changes. Our flag paths were erased, tape gone, underbrush reclaimed as if we'd never passed. The grove had shifted overnight. Trees seemed closer, the clearing smaller. Samples from the day before were dust in our vials, wilted beyond recognition. Unease turned to quiet dread as we tried to resume work. The glimpses grew bolder, no longer just eyes but forms. Gaunt silhouettes slipping between trunks, vanishing when pursued. Eliza brushed it off as feral people, maybe squatters avoiding the law, but Doc shook his head. This grove's locked for a reason. Nature's got its own guardians. We found more carvings on rocks and roots, depictions of figures like us, absorbed into the foliage, vines twisting through limbs. Pete grew withdrawn, staring into the undergrowth, whispering responses to the rustling leaves. By afternoon, the touches began, cold brushes on skin, like fingers grazing an arm or neck, gone when you whipped around. No one admitted it at first, but the fear was palpable, the silence amplifying every rustle, every unspoken doubt. That second night was when it unraveled. The fire died early, smothered by an unseen dampness, leaving us in near darkness broken only by headlamps. The tents shook harder, roots creaking as they surfaced, coiling around stakes like they meant to pull us under. Pete bolted upright in his sleeping bag, eyes wild. "They're calling," he muttered, scrambling out into the night. We followed, beams sweeping the grove, catching glimpses of pale forms retreating into the bark. Pete chased one, disappearing into the ferns. We called his name until our voices hoarsed, but he was gone. No trace, just his flashlight abandoned on a root, beam flickering weakly. The rustling intensified, patterns spelling intrusions in our minds. Leave or ours, imagined or real. Eliza broke down by the fire pit, tears streaking her face as she confessed feeling pulls, cold touches urging her deeper. Doc tried to rally us, packing gear for an early exit, but his hands shook, eyes darting to the shadows where eyes gleamed back. Dawn brought no solace. The grove tighter still, paths looped in circles that led back to camp. We searched for Pete fruitlessly, finding only fresh carvings, a figure resembling him, woven into a tree's outline. The touches escalated, brushes turning to tugs, vines snagging ankles, branches scraping skin like deliberate warnings. Eliza succumbed next. She wandered off mid-search, drawn by a glimpse that whispered her name in the leaves. "It's peaceful in there," she said faintly before the undergrowth swallowed her. Doc and I pressed on, desperation fueling our steps, but the grove resisted, roots tripping us, silence pressing like a weight on our chests. He paused at a cluster of ancient oaks, face ashen. "My old partner, lost in woods like these years ago." I hear him now. Before I could stop him, a cold touch brushed his arm, and he stepped into the foliage, vanishing with a rustle that echoed like a sigh. Alone, the isolation crushed me. The glimpses constant now, touches insistent, pulling at my resolve. The grove's silence haunted, a realistic terror of nature reclaiming what was forbidden, eroding sanity with subtle claims. I fled blindly, hacking through vines that clawed back, the rustling pursuing like accusations. Hours blurred. I stumbled through the fence gap as dusk fell, collapsing on a service trail where rangers found me babbling about guardians in the bark. Searches turned up nothing. No team, no camp, just endless grove swallowing evidence. Officials blamed exposure, unstable ground from old mines beneath. The area stayed locked, fences mended. But I know that silence hides a reclaiming force, glimpses of something ancient and unyielding woven into the wild. Years later, far from the ridges in a quiet suburb, the grove lingers like a shadow in my mind. On still nights, leaves outside my window rustle in patterns. Cold brushes ghost my skin in dreams. The samples I saved wilted to dust, but the terror remains, grounded, plausible, a dread of intruding where nature guards its own. Sometimes I feel the pull to return, to chase those glimpses deeper, joining my team in the bark's embrace. The Appalachians keep their locked secrets, and I wonder if the silence will ever let me go. Story 8. I never considered myself an adventurer, but after years cooped up in a desk job in Charleston, the pull of the West Virginia wilds became irresistible. It was the spring of 2011 when I signed up for an eco tour with a small group. Me, a quiet accountant seeking escape. Our guide, Hank, a weathered local with stories etched into his face like tree rings. Sarah, a teacher from Ohio, with a camera always at the ready. And Tom, a burly retiree who'd hiked these hills his whole life. The tour promised pristine views of the Monongahela forest, but Hank detoured us off the marked trails, drawn by old tales of the Band Basin. A deep, bowl-shaped valley closed off by the Forest Service for erosion risks from abandoned coal mines. "It's a beauty untouched," he said with a wink, ignoring the rusted fences and warning signs about unstable ground. Locals whispered darker reasons. Cherokee legends of a cursed hollow where the earth swallowed intruders, or hideouts for feral families who'd shunned society after the mine collapses, living like shadows in the ridges. We laughed it off as folklore, slipping through a gap in the wire, the air thick with the scent of blooming dogwoods and damp soil, eager for the forbidden allure. The descent was steep, switchbacks carved by deer trails winding down through thickets of rhododendron that brushed our legs like warnings. The ridges curved inward, forming a natural amphitheater that amplified every sound, our footsteps echoing back like distant company, birdsong swelling into a chorus before fading abruptly. Hank led with confidence, pointing out rare wildflowers clinging to the slopes. But as we reached the basin floor, the atmosphere shifted. The ground leveled into a lush meadow ringed by ancient hardwoods, a stream meandering through like a vein of silver. But the beauty fell off, too still, the air heavier, carrying a faint metallic tang from the old mines below. We set up camp by the water's edge, pitching tents on a grassy knoll, the bowl shape funneling the breeze into soft sighs. Sarah snapped photos of the wild irises blooming along the banks, while Tom gathered wood for a fire. I helped Hank unpack, but couldn't shake the sense of being observed, the ridges looming like silent judges. As dusk settled, the first murmurs rose, subtle at first, like buried conversations surfacing from the earth, muffled and indistinct, blending with the stream's gurgle. We dismissed them as wind through the crevices or water over rocks, gathering around the crackling fire to share sandwiches and stories. Hank spun yarns about the basin's history, how miners in the 20s had dug too deep, causing collapses that swallowed whole crews, their pleas echoing in the shafts before silence claimed them. Sarah laughed nervously, but Tom grew quiet, staring into the flames. The murmurs persisted, weaving in and out of our talk, almost like responses, faint echoes of pleas carried on the water. I strained to listen, heart picking up a notch, but they remained just out of clarity and nagging itch in the mind. Night deepened the basin's isolation. Stars pricked the sky above the ridges, but down here, the darkness pressed close, the fire's glow a fragile barrier. We retired to our tents, the ground cool beneath sleeping bags, but sleep came fitful. The murmurs grew closer in the quiet hours, rising from the soil like exhalations, whispering fragments that tugged at memories I'd rather forget. My father's long illness, the regrets I'd buried with him. Morning light filtered hazy through the canopy, revealing the changes. Artifacts had appeared overnight. Small stone relics half buried in the meadow, faces contorted in crude carvings, like old native idols or miners' talismans unearthed by the shifting earth. They weren't there the day before. Hank examined one, brow furrowed. Erosion must have brought him up, he muttered, but his voice lacked surety. Sarah photographed them eagerly, while Tom poked at the soil with a stick, unearthing more. Rusted tools tangled in roots, and deeper, bones, small at first, animal maybe, but one fragment looked human, crumbling to dust in his hands. "What the hell?" he whispered, face paling. The murmurs returned with the breeze, amplified by the basin's shape, now sounding like hushed regrets of past souls. Words like stay or mine threading through the air. We tried to laugh it off, packing for a short explore before heading out, but the ground felt alive underfoot, subtle pulses like a heartbeat far below. The day wore on in a haze of unease. We followed the stream upstream, Hank pointing out geological features, cracks in the earth from subsidence, vines masking old mine entrances like scars. But the artifacts multiplied, more idols dotting the banks, faces twisted in silent screams. Tom grew obsessed, digging at one spot where the murmurs seemed loudest, unearthing a cluster of bones that turned to powder on exposure. "These ain't animal," he said, voice shaking. "Folks were here, trapped." Sarah backed away, camera forgotten, while I felt the dread settle deeper, the basin's bowl trapping not just sound but our growing fear. The murmurs clarified in the afternoon quiet, recounting snippets that hit personal. My name murmured low, laced with my guilt over not being there for Dad's last days. Hank heard his own past regrets, eyes widening. "It's the echoes," he insisted. "Minds play tricks." But as shadows lengthened, the ground pulsed faintly, drawing us in like a slow tide. That first night back at camp was when the real terror crept in. The fires sputtered against the damp, the ridges black silhouettes against a moonless sky. We huddled close, but the murmurs rose closer, whispering regrets of past intruders, names we didn't know, pleas for escape that mirrored our unspoken thoughts. Sarah confessed hearing her estranged sister's voice, a loss she'd never shared, calling from the earth. Tom nodded, transfixed, muttering about his war buddies lost overseas. The ground pulsed stronger now, vibrations through our boots like the basin breathing. Sometime after midnight, Sarah stood suddenly, eyes glazed. "She's calling me," she whispered, wandering toward the stream's source, the murmurs swelling around her. We grabbed her, but she pulled free, disappearing into the mist rolling off the water. No splash, no cry, just absorbed into the maze of reeds and shadows. Panic clawed at us. Hank and I searched with flashlights, beams cutting the dark, but the basin looped our paths, ridges echoing our calls mockingly. Tom refused to join, sitting by the dying fire, listening to the whispers. Dawn brought a gray pallor, the fog thick in the bowl, muffling everything but the murmurs. Tom's tent was empty, his gear untouched, footprints leading toward a cluster of idols where bones lay scattered. We called his name, voices bouncing back distorted, laced with pleas. The ground pulsed insistently, drawing our gaze to cracks in the earth. Old mine vents, perhaps, exhaling the past. Hank broke then, confessing regrets from his guiding days, accidents he'd covered up. "They're pulling me," he said, stepping toward a pulsing fissure, the murmurs enveloping him like old friends. I lunged, but he slipped into the mist, vanishing as silently as the others. Alone, the isolation crushed me, the basin's quiet dread eroding my will, whispers recounting my failures in intimate detail. The ground seemed to undulate, artifacts surfacing like accusations, bones crumbling under my touch. Terror surged. I fled uphill, scrambling the switchbacks, branches whipping my face, the murmurs pursuing like echoes in my head. Hours blurred into exhaustion. I crested the ridge as rain began, stumbling through the fence to the main trail. A ranger patrol found me collapsed, dehydrated, and raving about voices from the earth. They searched the basin for weeks, but found no trace, no bodies, no camp, just erosion scars and endless hollows swallowing evidence. Officials blamed subsidence, hallucinations from mine gases seeping up. The area stayed banned, fences reinforced with patrols. But I know the dread born of violating that ground. The murmurs persist in quiet moments, faint at first, rising from silence like buried regrets. Years later, in my apartment far from the hollows, still nights bring them back. Pulses underfoot in dreams, whispers of names lost to the basin. Were they feral survivors, guardians of forgotten minds, or just the earth's way of reclaiming its wounds? The confusion lingers, a sorrow that veils every echo, pulling at the edges of sanity. Sometimes, I feel the basin's call, a subtle dread wondering if my friends wait below, murmuring for me to join in the pulse. The Appalachians hold their banned secrets close, and I fear one day the ground will open for me too. Story 9. I've been carrying the weight of my brother's death for too long, the kind of grief that hollows you out and leaves echoes where peace should be. He went missing on a hunting trip up in the Smokies back in 2014. Body never found, just his rifle leaning against a tree like he'd set it down for a moment and walked away. Folks said bear or cliff fall, but I knew better. He'd always talked about finding solitude in places no one else dared go. By the summer of 2019, I needed that same escape, something to quiet the noise in my head. So I headed alone into the quarantined clearing, a remote plateau in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, sealed off after a mysterious outbreak years back. Some say Lyme variant, others whispered tainted water from old moonshine stills poisoning the ground. Signs ringed the perimeter, quarantine zone, no entry, health hazard, barbed wire sagging but still sharp. Locals avoided it like a grave, muttering about feral holdouts or forest madness, claiming anyone who lingered. I slipped through a gap at dusk, pack light with tent, food, and water filter, the isolation already intoxicating as the ridges closed behind me. The hiking was grueling, faint trails overgrown with briars that tore my jeans, the air thick with humidity and the scent of wild onions crushed underfoot. No birds called this deep. The silence wrapped around me like a bomb at first, muffling the world I'd left. The clearing emerged suddenly, a broad, flat expanse ringed by dense pines, grass tall and waving in the faint breeze, dotted with the skeletal remains of abandoned huts from old logging camps. Doors hung ajar on rusted hinges, roofs caved in under decades of snow and rain. I set up camp near the center, on a patch of bare earth that felt oddly warm, pitching my small tent as twilight bled the sky purple. The solitude hit like a drug. No voices, no expectations, just me and the mountains breathing slow. I built no fire that first night, eating cold rations and lying back to watch stars prick through the canopy gaps, the quiet eroding the edges of my sorrow, inviting a peace I'd forgotten. But as full dark settled, the forms appeared at the edges, silhouettes in the tree lean, tall and indistinct, dissolving when my flashlight beams swept over them. At first, I thought shadows from branches swaying, or maybe deer frozen in the light. They hovered just beyond clarity, mimicking the outline of man standing still. The air began to hum, then a low frequency vibrating in my chest, unsettling my balance like standing too close to a bass speaker you can't see. I shook it off as tinnitus from the altitude, crawling into the tent with the flap zipped tight. Sleep came in waves, dreams laced with my brother's voice, calling from far off, but waking brought no relief. Morning light revealed the huts clearer, contents undisturbed for years. Overturned chairs, rusted pots on cold hearths, personal items like faded photographs curling on tables. Curiosity pulled me to explore one, the door creaking as I pushed inside. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light, and on a makeshift shelf lay journals, leather-bound, pages brittle. Entries detailed similar intrusions. Lone hikers or hunters seeking solitude, noting forms at the edges. The hum, a pull to stay forever. The last pages abrupt, ink trailing off mid-sentence, as if the writer had simply stopped, drawn outside. I spent the day wandering the clearing, the isolation still sweet despite the unease. The forms returned sporadically, always peripheral, silhouettes that shifted when I blinked, dissolving in direct light like smoke. The hum persisted low and constant, a vibration that made my teeth ache faintly, thoughts slowing as if wading through water. I found more huts, each with echoes of past lives. A child's shoe half buried in the floorboards, a harmonica on a windowsill gathering dust. One journal mentioned, joining the watchers, entries growing fervent about an invitation to belong, free from the world's weight. My brother's face flashed in my mind. Had he found this place? The pull started subtle, a quiet invitation whispering in the silence, urging me to linger, to let the clearing claim the grief. Twilight brought the forms nearer, no longer just edges but stepping into the grass, mimicking my posture as I stood by the tent, arms at sides, head tilted, dissolving only when I moved suddenly. Heart pounding, I retreated inside, the hum swelling to fill the space, eroding sharp thoughts in a haze. That night, the quiet worked deeper. I lay awake, flashlight in hand, sweeping the beam through the mesh window, catches of pale silhouettes retreating just beyond. They mirror me now. When I sat up, they sat. When I paced the small space, faint echoes of steps outside. The pull intensified, a sorrowful invitation to step out, join the undisturbed peace they'd found. Dreams bled into waking, my brother among them, form elongated in the mist, beckoning without words. I woke to scratches on my arms, thin lines raised and red, patterns like crude maps etching paths through the clearing, leading to the treeline. No pain, just the mark of something deliberate in the night. Panic flickered, but the hum soothed it, the isolation wrapping tighter, rewriting loneliness into belonging. I tried to pack, hands sluggish, the forms gathering bolder in the gray dawn, postures inviting. The second day blurred. I forced myself to explore the far edges, seeking an exit trail, but the clearing looped subtly, huts reappearing where they'd not been, the quarantine fence always just out of reach through the trees. Journals in another shack detailed the same, paths shifting, forms mimicking to lure closer. The hum unbalanced me fully now, steps weaving as thoughts eroded, memories of my brother's search fading, grief softening into acceptance. Twilight again, and the forms pressed in, silhouettes clear enough to see gone outlines, faces hollow but familiar, dissolving when light hit. They mimicked my every gesture, raising a hand to shield eyes, crouching by the stream for water. The pull was overwhelming, an invitation to shed the pain, join the quiet company in forbidden solitude. I felt myself standing, drawn toward them, the hum singing approval. Waking fully only when scratches deepened on my skin, patterns mapping deeper into the woods. Terror cut through the haze. I grabbed my pack, fleeing across the grass, forms parting like mist but following in periphery. The hum pursued, vibrating in my bones, thoughts fracturing into loops of invitation. Branches clawed as I crashed through the tree-line, the clearing resisting, ground sucking at boots, air thickening to slow escape. Hours or minutes. I stumbled onto a ranger road at dusk, collapsing as headlights found me. They quarantined me briefly, test negative for disease, blaming exposure and dehydration for scratches, the ravings about forms. Searches found no clearing as I described, just dense forest, no huts, no journals. The area stayed sealed, stories dismissed as delusion. But the lingering shadow remains. Years on, in crowded places the isolation calls back intoxicating. The hum faint in quiet rooms, scratches itching on my arms when alone. Forms appear in dreams or reflections, silhouettes at edges, mimicking posture, inviting join. My brother's among them now, or so the pole whispers, a sorrowful confusion blurring loss into eternal company. The mountains guard their quarantined secrets, eroding thoughts with subtle dread. And sometimes, in forbidden solitude, I feel the clearing's quiet reclaiming me still. Story 10. I'd always chased the thrill of the unknown in the Appalachians, those deep cuts in the earth where the ridges hide things folks don't talk about in daylight. It was the autumn of 2016 when my old climbing buddies and I decided to tackle the restricted ravine, a sheer gorge in the George Washington National Forest, banned by the rangers for flash flood from sudden storms up on the plateaus. Signs warned of unstable rock and sudden rises in the creek that carved it, but we'd heard whispers in the climbing forums about pristine walls perfect for rappelling, untouched since the old days. There were 4 of us. Me, the cautious one with the ropes, my best friend Kyle, always pushing limits. Lena, our photographer who captured every descent like art. And Quiet Dave, the strongest belayer you'd ever meet. Locals in the valley shook their heads when we mentioned it over coffee. That ravine's got a hush to it, claims more than water ever could. Tales of feral hermits or mine collapses trapping souls in the depths. We brushed it off as tall tales, parking at a hidden pull-off and hiking in under cover of fog, packs heavy with harnesses, carabiners, and enough gear for a weekend drop. The approach was rugged, bushwhacking through laurel thickets that snagged like they meant to hold us back. The air cool and laced with the scent of wet shale. We reached the rim by midday, peering down into the gorge, a narrow slit in the mountain, walls slick with moss and veiled in mist from the creek far below. Echoes rose faintly, our voices bouncing back distorted, like someone mocking from the shadows. We rigged anchors to sturdy pines, testing knots twice, and began to rappel, bodies swinging free against the rock face, the drop maybe 200 feet to the ravine floor. The hint started small as we descended. Faint scratches on the walls, parallel lines like tallies etched deep into the stone, counting visitors or days trapped. We joked about it being climber graffiti, but the marks were old, weathered smooth at the edges. Kyle laughed, brushing one with his glove. Previous adventurers marking their conquests. But the ravine narrowed below us, the walls closing in like a funnel, sunlight barely piercing the depths. At the bottom, the creek trickled over polished boulders, the air colder and heavier, carrying a mineral tang from the rock. We set up camp on a gravel bar, tents wedged between massive fallen slabs, the ravine's hush enveloping us. No birds, no insects, just the water's murmur and our own breaths amplified by the walls. Lena snapped shots of the soaring cliffs, while Dave scouted for climbing routes. As evening fell, the echoes played tricks. We'd call to each other across the bar, and the return came delayed, warped into warnings, turn back or stay, easy to blame on acoustics, but it unsettled the mood. Water trickled unnaturally in places, seeping upward along cracks in the rock like defying gravity, pooling in shallow depressions that reflected our headlamps oddly. We built a small fire with driftwood, sharing beers and stories of past climbs, but the tallies caught our eyes again. Clusters higher up, unreachable without gear, as if scratched by someone clinging desperately. That first night, the hush deepened. We turned in early, exhausted from the drop, the creek's lullaby masking subtler sounds. Kyle woke us around midnight, voice low and shaken. Hands, he whispered, flashlight trembling on the wall near his tent. pale ones reaching from a crevice, like fingers feeling for something. We searched, beams cutting the dark, finding only shadows and damp rock, but a narrow fissure gaped where he pointed, deep enough to swallow light. No prints, no residue, just the hint of movement lingering in our minds. Sleep came uneasy after that, dreams laced with grasps from the dark. Morning revealed more changes. Gear went missing overnight. Kyle's spare rope coiled neatly but gone. Lena's camera bag unzipped with lenses rearranged. In their place, odd stones appeared. Smooth river rocks etched with faint scratches, like miniature tallies placed deliberately in side packs. Prank, Dave suggested, but his eyes darted to the walls. The ravine felt tighter, echoes sharper, distorting laughter into something hollow. The second day, we explored upstream, the gorge narrowing further, forcing us to wade the creek, water cold enough to numb legs. Hints escalated, breaths on necks when alone, warm exhales without source, shadows climbing the walls and periphery, elongated forms scaling sheer rock without holds, vanishing when turned to. Lena froze mid-photo, swearing a hand had brushed her hair from behind. We found more tallies, fresh ones lower down, as if added recently. Water defied sense again, trickling upward in thin streams along vertical faces, collecting in crevices that dripped like tears. Dave grew quiet, staring into fissures, muttering about hearing scratches inside the stone. By afternoon, exhaustion set in, the hush pressing like a weight, eroding casual talk into whispers. Gear tampering worsened. Harnesses loosened subtly. Carabiners swapped for those etched stones. We checked anchors twice, paranoia creeping as echoes mocked our plans, climb out returning as stay down. Night 2 brought the real dread. The fire struggled against rising damp from the creek, shadows leaping unnaturally on the walls. We sat close, flashlights ready, but the breaths returned, close now on necks and ears, carrying faint sighs like regrets. Shadows moved bolder, climbing from crevices, elongated and pale, mimicking our huddled postures from above. Cal saw the hands again, reaching pale and elongated from a high crack, fingers curling as if beckoning. He bolted toward it, climbing handholds in panic, but slipped back, face ashen. "They're counting us," he said, pointing to new tallies nearby, 4 fresh sets. Lena broke then, confessing the pull she felt, an invitation from the depths to let go, join whatever waited in the hush. We tied ourselves in tents that night, ropes linking us, but the hints invaded, scratches on canvas like nails testing, stones rolling inside without entry. Dawn revealed the loss. Lena's tent empty, rope cut clean, footprints leading to a narrow crevice where water trickled upward. We called, echoes returning pleas distorted into her voice. Panic surged. Kyle climbed recklessly toward a ledge, swearing hands pulled from below. Shadows swarmed in our lights, breaths hot on skin. Dave froze, eyes glazing as breaths whispered his losses. A family he'd left behind years ago. "They're offering peace," he murmured, stepping toward a fissure, pale hands emerging briefly to guide. Kyle grabbed him, but Dave pulled free, vanishing into the depths with a sigh that echoed long. Kyle raged then, hacking at walls, but a shadow climbed over him, breaths overwhelming. He tumbled into the creek, pulled under by unseen currents, surfacing no more. Alone, the ravine's hush crushed me. Hints constant, breaths intimate, shadows mirroring every move, tallies adding my mark. Water rose subtly, flash flood hint without storm, forcing climb. I rappelled frantic, ropes fraying from unseen cuts, hands brushing legs from crevices. The walls closed, echoes warning restricted in my own voice. I crested the rim as rain began, collapsing in mud, rangers finding me days later, hypothermic and babbling about hints in the depths. Searches found nothing. No bodies, no gear, just empty ravine swallowing evidence. Blamed on flood, the area band tighter. But the hush follows, realistic horror of the restricted. Faint scratches and dreams, breaths on neck in quiet, shadows climbing walls at periphery. 3 lost to the depths, pulled by hints too subtle to fight. Confusion lingers, feral guardians, trapped echoes, or the gorge reclaiming intruders. Sorrow weighs, wondering if they found peace in the hush, while I carry the dread. The ravine's quiet pull eroding sanity on still nights. Sometimes I feel hands reaching, inviting descent again. The mountains keep their restricted secrets, and I fear the tally waits for my return. Story 11. I'd spent most of my life chasing quiet water in the Appalachians, those hidden creeks and rivers that wind through the hollows like they know secrets the rest of the world forgot. My brother Caleb and I grew up fishing the New River Gorge, learning to read the currents the way other folks read books. After he passed in that accident on the Gully 2 years back, his kayak pinned under a strainer, body never recovered. I couldn't look at moving water the same, but the pull never left me. By the summer of 2022, the grief had turned into something restless, and I convinced my old friend Travis to join me on a trip down a lesser-known stretch of the Greenbrier River in West Virginia. The map showed a falls marked forbidden, off-limits by the Park Service for sacred indigenous sites, old Monacan ground with petroglyphs the rangers protected fierce. Locals called it Whisper Falls, said the water carried voices of the old ones, guarding against outsiders. We ignored the barriers, faded buoys and signs chained across the river, slipping our kayaks past at dawn, the mist rising off the surface like breath from something alive. The paddling was peaceful at first, the river wide and lazy, flanked by steep banks thick with hemlock and rhododendron blooming pink against the green. Sunlight dappled the water, and we drifted more than stroked, talking low about old times, Caleb's laugh, the way he'd always find the deepest pools. Travis was quieter than usual, nursing his own losses after a divorce. But the solitude felt healing, the current carrying us gentle toward the roar ahead. As we neared the restricted zone, traces emerged, ripples spreading across the surface without cause, concentric circles leading upstream like invitations against the flow. No fish jumping, no rocks disturbing the bottom, just perfect rings pulling our eyes toward the falls. The roar grew, a constant thunder masking subtler sounds, but I swore I heard chants blending with the water. Low, rhythmic murmurs in a language that tugged at something deep, like half-remembered dreams. Travis heard it too, pausing his paddle. "Wind through the gorge?" he suggested, but his voice wavered. We beached the kayaks below the cascade, a 30-foot drop veiling a sheer cliff, spray rising in clouds that caught the light like ghosts. Curiosity overrode caution. We tied off the boats and climbed the rocky bank, slick with moss and mist. Behind the falls, a narrow ledge led to a cave mouth hidden by the curtain of water, the roar deafening up close. We ducked inside, headlamps cutting the dark, the air cool and heavy with mineral damp. The walls were covered in drawings, petroglyphs etched deep, figures of intruders crossing lines, vanishing into swirls that looked like water, claiming them back. Stick people with kayaks or canoes, lines trailing off into nothingness, warnings clear as day. Chants echoed stronger here, bouncing off stone, blending with the falls into a rhythm that settled in my chest. Travis traced one drawing, his finger lingering on a figure that resembled 2 men in boats. "This place don't want us," he murmured, but we lingered, the mystery clinging like the spray on our skin. Traces appeared on the cave floor too, ripples and shallow pools leading deeper, though no current flowed. We backed out, uneasy, the chants following us into the light. We camped on a gravel bar downstream a ways, not daring to stay too close to the falls, tents pitched under overhanging ledges as dusk bled the sky. The roar was constant background, a white noise that should have lulled us to sleep, but the subtler sounds crept in, chants faint but persistent, carried on the mist. Travis fished while I gathered wood, but our lines stayed slack, ripples forming around the lures without bites, leading back upstream. Night fell heavy in the gorge, stars hidden by the high walls, our fire a small defiance against the dark. We talk about Caleb, voices low, the chants weaving through our words like responses. Travis grew distant, eyes on the water. "Hear him sometimes," he said suddenly. "Caleb calling from the flow." I nodded, throat tight. We'd both been there the day he died, pulling frantic but too late. Sleep came fitful, the fall's mystery wrapping around dreams of water pulling under. Midnight woke me to tugs on my fishing line, left baited overnight, sharp pulls against the current, as if something tested from below. I reeled slow, expecting a snag, but the line went slack, then tugged harder, leading upstream toward the falls. Travis stirred, murmuring about traces in the spray. We shone lights on the water. Figures danced in the mist rising from the cascade, ethereal yet tangible. Silhouettes moving in rhythms that matched the chants. Elongated forms swaying like reeds in unseen wind. No faces, just outlines against the moonlight, beckoning subtle. Travis stood, transfixed. "It's him," he whispered. Caleb's posture unmistakable, the way he held his head. The pull hit me too, a sorrowful invitation to follow the flow, join where the water claimed. Tugs turned insistent on the line, dragging my rod toward the river. We resisted, huddling by the fire, but the chants swelled, personal now. Names murmured in the roar. Dawn brought gray light and heavier mist. The falls a veil we couldn't see through. Travis's tent flap hung open, his sleeping bag empty, footprints in the gravel leading upstream, disappearing at the water's edge. I called his name, voice swallowed by the roar, echoes returning distorted. His own, then Caleb's, blending in a chance. Panic clawed as I searched the bank, finding his paddle half submerged, ripples leading behind the cascade. The cave drawings haunted me. Intruders vanishing, traces pulling into the flow. I climbed again, desperate. The ledge slicker now, spray soaking through clothes. Inside, fresh scratches marred the walls. New figures etched hasty, one resembling Travis stepping into swirls. Chants echoed intimate here, recounting regrets. My failure to save Caleb, words unsaid. Figures danced closer in the outer spray, tangible hands brushing the water curtain, tugging at my resolve. Terror overrode grief. I fled the cave, scrambling down to the kayak, paddling frantic against the current. Traces pursued, ripples racing alongside, tugs on the hull like unseen hands guiding back. The roar masked my sobs, chants clinging as the gorge widened. Hours blurred. I reached the barriers at dusk, portaging around to safer water, collapsing on a public launch where rafters found me shivering and babbling about traces beyond the falls. Rangers searched for days, but found no sign of Travis, no kayak, no body, just endless rivers swallowing evidence. Blamed on undertow, the area restricted tighter, sacred sites cited to keep folks out. But the fall's mystery clings like damp on skin. Years on, quiet streams bring it back. Ripples without cause in dreams. Chants faint in moving water. Travis and Caleb wait there. I fear, dancing in the spray, their forms ethereal yet calling. The dread of crossing into the forbidden's flow lingers, a sorrowful confusion blurring loss into eternal current. Sometimes, on still nights, I feel the tug to return, paddle upstream to join where the water claims its own. The mountains guard their sacred whispers, and I wonder if one day the traces will lead me beyond the falls forever.